Hi, I'm AJ DeBonis, and welcome to Season 6 of Interfaith Matters. The need for a recognition of our common humanity and standing in solidarity with and caring for our neighbors is at the heart of Pope Francis's recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, or On Fraternity and Social Friendship. It was inspired by the Abu Dhabi Declaration, a joint statement signed by Pope Francis and Sheikh Ahmed Al-Tayyeb, Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, on advancing a culture of peace and mutual respect among people of different faiths. To talk with me about Fratelli Tutti, I'll be joined today by Father James Lochren, Director of the Graymoor Ecumenical and InterReligious Institute located in New York City, and Vicar General of the Franciscan Friars of the Atonement, a Roman Catholic religious order founded on the ideal of unity that's devoted to promoting dialogue within the Christian Church and between religions. In light of World Interfaith Harmony Week, and in the spirit of Pope Francis's call for a culture of encounter, Father Jim and I invite you to join a free online discussion of Fratelli Tutti with diverse faith leaders and scholars on February 3rd. You can hear more about that event and how to join us at the end of this episode. I'm joined today by Father James Lochren, SA, who is the director of the Graymoor Ecumenical and InterReligious Institute in New York City, and who is also the Vicar General of the Franciscan Friars of the Atonement. Father Jim, thanks so much for being with us today.
Glad to be with you.
Yeah. So I thought we could start out by just hearing a little bit about yourself, particularly, your vocation to the Franciscan Friars of the Atonement. How did you find yourself, getting to this moment in time, and how does your background inform your understanding of the importance of this encyclical that we're hoping to talk about today, Fratelli Tutti?
Well, I've always been curious about why Christians couldn't worship together. It's kind of, I guess, almost like a nerdy thing for a teenager to question, but I did. And so I would often visit churches that weren't Catholic just to experience their kind of liturgies and the way that they preached and whatever else. I just had this feeling deep in my soul. And I was in religious education teaching at my home parish in Massachusetts, and a friar of the Atonement was assigned to the staff, and he and I began to talk, and I had just graduated from the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, and I just felt that it was time to do something, and so I was interested in thinking about at least a religious order. I was always drawn to the life of Saint Francis of Assisi. So, and his vision of how the incarnate one Jesus is there in the lives of every human being. And so I decided to ask this priest, about his community. And I had no idea that there was actually a Roman Catholic religious community that had as one of its main ministries the value of Christian unity and also interreligious dialogue. I came to find out later on. So I was very drawn to that. I was also drawn to the Franciscan lifestyle of fraternity, of praying together, living together. I think that what we call the diocesan priesthood is a tremendous gift, but I was never really tempted to live the kind of individual lifestyle that a priest in a diocese has to live in. So I certainly wanted religious life so that I would have brothers around me who believed in the same sort of things, and we could pray together and eat and chat and do all those things that companions do on the road. So it was good. So I just let me see. Just a couple of days ago, I celebrated the 38th anniversary of my first profession of vows as a friar. So it's been quite a journey in different places throughout the world, in Jamaica, Virginia. Ever since I became director of the Commission on Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs for the Archdiocese of New York under Cardinal O'Connor in the late 1990s, then under Cardinal Egan. And then the community asked me to take over Graymoor Ecumenical and Interreligious Institute around 2002. And so I've been doing that ever since.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the foundation of Graymoor? Has it been around prior to you coming on staff, and how was it founded? What were the kind of specific goals of the institute, and what are they now?
Well, it goes back to the roots of the community itself. It's named Graymoor Ecumenical and Interreligious Institute because Graymoor is the mother house, the headquarters, the major friary of our worldwide community. It's the home of the Franciscan friars and the Franciscan sisters of the Atonement. And going way back to the foundational roots of Graymoor itself, Father Paul Watson, the founder of the friars, and Mother Lorena White, the founder of the sisters, came to Graymoor in 1898 to begin a Franciscan religious community in the Episcopal Church. It was a great experiment at the time because there weren't that many Episcopal religious orders. So they went to work, but they also believed very much that somehow, some way, they could drive the idea in the Episcopal Church and in the Anglican Communion of the necessity of coming into some kind of reunion with the Holy See, with Rome. And so they pursued that, and then they also realized that that was not the only relationship, ecumenically speaking, that there should be a broader concept of Christian unity among all Christians. So anyway, around 1966, after the Second Vatican Council, the friars realized that the methods that we were using pre-Vatican II to spread the news about Christian unity were no longer applicable, that we had to come up with a Vatican II way of addressing ecumenism. And so we established the Graymoor Ecumenical Institute. It wasn't called InterReligious yet, at Graymoor, where it was based until 1984 or so, when we moved into the Interchurch Center in Manhattan. And around 1994, we added the word interreligious to our name because we realized that that was a whole field of endeavor for the sake of the good of humanity that we really were interested in being part of. So we expanded the notion of ecumenism to include the interfaith. So it's been going on since then. About 50 years ago, 1971, we took over a magazine that was called Faith and Order Trends, and we renamed it Ecumenical Trends. And so we published that bi-monthly. It was a monthly for many years. Now it's a bi-monthly periodical dedicated to ecumenical and interfaith ideas.
You mentioned, the shift, I guess you could say, at Vatican II for taking up anew this project of ecumenical and interreligious dialogue. I wonder if we can get into Fratelli Tutti a little bit here, the encyclical written by Pope Francis, which was published just a few months ago,
Yes.
calling for, among other things, it's a very kind of rich, robust encyclical, interfaith dialogue and social fraternity. And coming out of Vatican II, Nostra, tate was such an important document for Catholics because it was seen as a landmark for thinking through not only Catholic and Jewish relations, but how the church, opened itself up in some ways to interreligious dialogue anew. So I wonder if you can situate kind of this encyclical. First of all, if you could tell us just what, for those listeners who aren't Catholic, what an encyclical is, and then try to think through how this document, Fratelli Tutti, is a development from what we've seen in the past 70 years in the church since Nostra Aetate during Vatican II.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Wow. Okay, I'll try. No, it's one of those things that is uniquely Roman Catholic in the sense. Catholics hold to a concept that we have two sources of what we call magisterial teaching. And that's kind of redundant to say because magisterium itself is teaching. But anyway, what we mean by that is authoritative teaching. The Pope plays a role in writing various levels of authoritative teachings. There might be something legalistic, a change of a rule or something in canon law. That doesn't affect theology very much, but it affects the way we do things. He would call that what they call a motu proprio. It's just a quick message. It's a ruling, usually, again, defined by canon law, that the Pope has authority to do. He also has the authority to change the catechism of the Catholic Church by redefining something in that book. So, for example, a few years back, Pope Francis changed the wording of our teaching on capital punishment, which caused some stirring, some slight controversy, not too much, but he was careful the way he worded it. But basically, he views capital punishment authoritatively as not really ever appropriate in any situation these days. So it's kind of a way that he exercises authority. Then he also can do something called an apostolic letter, which is a directive idea again, but it's more of a again, exercising authority in a general way, which allows for various kinds of interpretation. Then higher above that is the encyclical. And in the encyclical, which in a sense takes on the role of great authority, he can define within that encyclical the level to which Catholics grant obedience of conscience or whatever, or acceptance of the teaching. And sometimes it could be a pastoral, more of a recommendation level, a teaching like a sermon, or it could be something that's very much of a binding thing. So this encyclical Fratelli Tutti is not binding on Catholic consciences. Now, I don't want to get too technical because there's great room for debate in some of these things, but in Catholic circles. But in an encyclical, the Pope tends to write not just for Catholics, but it's his expression of how all human society should be guided. So it's usually a message like Fratelli Tutti, or like John the 23rd's Pacem in Terris, peace in the world, or like previous to Vatican II, Pope Pius XI's German encyclical Mit brennender Sorge, where he condemned racism. So there's all of that kind of level of teaching, which really is meant for the whole human society, not just Catholics. But it is a Catholic authoritative directive. It is, in a sense, it's not. We don't want to say it's infallible, because that becomes the level of dogma, but it is certainly the level of Catholic doctrine. It is a Catholic teaching, and it has great authority. It's important to note that Nostra, tate, the declaration on the Church's understanding of its relationship with other religions, has, in a sense, a greater authority than an encyclical, because it comes from an ecumenical council of the Church with the approval of the Pope. So it has a very high level of authority for Catholics. It's not a constitution, which is the highest level of a conciliar teaching, but it is a declaration of something that we would call simply the truth. And the title Nostra tate means in our time, which are the first words of that declaration. And in our time, we have seen, in 1965, we've come through 2 world wars, and we've seen the destruction of war. We've seen the Holocaust. We've seen all kinds of terrible things happen in our world. We're on the brink of nuclear disaster, whatever. All those feelings, we came to realize that we had to reach out in a loving way, in a supportive way, to other religions. We Catholics could no longer simply judge them as being as being outside the fold of salvation. So we had to deal with that. And so that becomes, in a sense, a foundational document for moving forward. One of the theological principles of accepting teachings from the church, and it really doesn't matter what church you're in, depending on how you view authoritative teaching, is that you have to receive the teaching, which isn't just giving you the book and putting it in your hand. You have to read it, you have to think about it, and you have to learn how to adjust to this over the generations. So we Catholics are still, quote unquote, receiving the teachings of the Second Vatican Council even after 60 years. And so one of the things that we have done in the Catholic Church, the greatest signs of Second Vatican II for most people were liturgical changes or social teachings. The depth and breadth of all the teachings of the Second Vatican Council are yet to be understood and received. But one of them, of course, was, as you mentioned, Nostra, tate. And it really did change the emphasis, at least in the leadership levels of the Catholic Church, regarding our relationship with other religions, and in the formation of clergy, etc. Yes, it is accessible to anyone who wants to read it, but you don't see a great sort of a tidal wave of Catholics who are even to this day familiar with it, which is unfortunate. But nonetheless, the leadership of the Catholic Church, primarily in the Pontifical Council for InterReligious Dialogue, and the other departments of the Holy See, went forward with dialogue with people of other faiths from the late 1960s all the way through the present. It's interesting to note, as a sidebar, that our relationship, our Roman Catholic relationship with the Jewish people, is still under the guidance of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. The reason for that is because of the foundations of Christianity. We can't really discuss who Jesus is without a conversation with the Jewish people. So it's that kind of relationship we have in a special way with the Jewish community. Our relationship with Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, etc., has to fall into the category of Nostra, of other paragraphs of Nostra, tate. It's not a very big document, but it was a launching pad for these dialogues that we had with individuals, mostly. A lot of these dialogues, too, didn't take place, on high levels in councils and theologians gathering in Rome or in Cairo or Amritsar or wherever. Most of the dialogues with people of other faiths, with the exception of the Jewish Catholic dialogue, took place in local regions of the world where Catholics were significant minorities and the people, adherents of other faiths, were the majority. Because it contextualizes the goals that we have in interreligious dialogue. Primarily, it is a dialogue of persons to persons, of hearts to hearts. It's a dialogue of peace. It's a dialogue of mutual understanding. And it's a dialogue of acceptance of the other. So it can really, as Francis says in Fratelli Tutti, it can really only happen when you befriend the other. And if you're in a place in the world where there just aren't people of that religion living around you, it becomes a difficult thing to do. So that's why a lot of the interreligious dialogues were localized. But we learned so much from those local dialogues over 60 years. And it was through gestures of the popes, too, like John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and, of course, Francis, that we had at the beginnings in the 1980s, there were gatherings in Assisi, Italy, which brought together the leaders of different religions, or the it's hard to say. Sometimes the politics within religions are different than our Western concepts. So the leadership there means something different than it does for us. But nonetheless, great thinkers and leaders in these other religions gathered together in Assisi with John Paul II, then again with Benedict, and now also with Francis, because of the again, the Franciscan centeredness of that city. It's a great, they were great gestures. I think it was John Paul II at the first gathering in Assisi who said, we've come together to pray, but not to pray together, which was kind of an interesting way of saying that while we recognize the value of prayer always, it becomes, we cannot practice a syncretist kind of thing. So it really helps us to make these distinctions that we need to make in light of Nostra Tate as we build up to Fratelli Tutti and what's been able to say. Now, don't forget, Fratelli Tutti is not primarily an interreligious encyclical. It is an encyclical on friendship and fraternity and sorority. It's an encyclical, really pushing the concept of universal brotherhood and sisterhood that goes beyond just a nice idea to encounter. But how do you encounter people who are different from you if you don't encounter their religious beliefs? And so in the encyclical, I just love the way that Pope Francis begins the encyclical with the story of Saint Francis of Assisi and Malik al-Kamal, the Sultan living in Egypt at the time. And he begins with that story because he also, Pope Francis, visited the Arab states, and he was in dialogue himself with the great Imam. So there were all these things going on that were parallels. Plus, Francis released Fratelli Tutti, which of course are the first words of encouragement that St. Francis gave to his followers. And in the early 13th century. So it was a great sort of Franciscan beginning to the encyclical that we Franciscans really appreciate, because he recalled that visit of Francis to the Sultan. And that was a very complex visit. When Francis went there, he expected to be martyred because he was going on the heels of a crusade. There's great debate today, but a lot of us have come to the conclusion that Francis wanted to emphasize peace. He didn't want to embrace killing. He himself had gone through a conversion of going from being a soldier in a war between Assisi and Perugia to becoming a pacifist. And so it wouldn't have been in his nature to support the crusade. He was there because he realized that this could be his entry point into encounter with Muslim leaders. He knew that the price of that encounter would probably be his death. So he and another friar went to see the Sultan, and they got an audience, and it was fascinating. They were there for several days. They had some theological discussions, but that pretty much got nowhere because they really weren't convincing each other of the rightness or wrongness of their religious beliefs. But what they did do was bond together in a friendship. And so this encounter becomes then the basis for the rest of the prose, you might say, in Fratelli Tutti, because then that's the springboard for Pope Francis to talk about intentional a friendship and fraternity and that kind of thing throughout the document. He also talks he has a whole section of the encyclical dedicated to the parable, the Christian parable of the Good Samaritan. And that also helps us understand how we treat the stranger or even our enemies. And so, one of the interesting things about that crusade against the Egyptian Sultan was that when the battle was lost by the Christians because the Muslim forces had dammed up water and flooded the plain, and the Christian troops were stuck in the mud, the Sultan could have slaughtered them, but instead he sent them food until they could get boats to get back to Europe. So, how you treat the stranger, how you treat the enemy, especially, is a very important Christian insight that Francis brings up in Fratelli Tutti. And so, with all of that said, he also has his last chapter dedicated to how we treat the other regarding religious differences. And so he goes into great detail about his own encounters with leaders of other faiths. And I think the main teaching point I come out with is that until we can lay aside fears, until we can lay aside, until we can lay aside misunderstandings and assumptions about the other and really encounter another human being who doesn't believe in the same way we believe about eternity, about life after death, about whatever, about the divinity, then we'll always harbor some kind of ignorance that leads to fear. And so how can you become a friend of someone if you're afraid of them? So it's a very powerful statement throughout the encyclical that we're always going beyond our fears, and this is and essentially this is a Christian principle of life and of faith. This is being Christ in the world. So it's certainly a bedrock teaching of all Christianity, and I'm so happy he's emphasizing it.
Mm. He mentions in chapter 6 of the encyclical, you've talked a little bit about this idea of the culture of encounter,
Yes.
which a fear, right, is the first stumbling block, I guess, to sort of entering into this culture of encounter and dialogue that Francis is so concerned with kind of emphasizing here. And I think about my own experiences with interreligious dialogue, and I think the idea of dialogue can often be equated with a kind of trite, polity or politeness.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that can bypass fundamental disagreements in favor of keeping, a shallow peace that there might be deeper issues kind of bubbling underneath the surface. But on the other end of the spectrum, I think most of the time people who are already in favor of this idea of dialogue are less prone to things like fanaticism and fundamentalism, some of the things he talks about in the encyclical, or maybe they're just convinced of their own certainty in matters of truth or morality or politics, and maybe are the ones who are most in need of, this personal challenge or encounter. So on the one hand, often when we think of dialogue, it can, you can have a failure to work through these incommensurable or conflicting differences. And on the other hand, you can have an unwillingness to even enter into that culture of encounter or mystery of encounter with another person who really might make you reassess some of your most deeply held beliefs or principles. And he talks about this. One of the things he mentions is, in particular, the idea of encounter in a digital age. And we're right now screen to screen, like so much of have been over the past year. So this is another big question, I guess. But what channels or avenues do you think that Francis lays out in Fratelli Tutti to avoid those two, I guess, dangers of thinking about dialogue as something which is either trite politeness or, if I go into a dialogue or encounter, it's, it can be fearful. And oftentimes those persons who experience fear are the ones who maybe are perhaps most in need of somebody reaching out to them Are there, suggestions that Francis makes that you find particularly helpful in this regard?
I think we have to understand that, as you said, people who are in the extremes of religious beliefs carry with them, I think, two fears. One is the fear that the other will somehow politically take over their, community with immigration and whatever. The other fear is that, and they'll be forced into doing something they don't want to do. The other thing is the fear of being converted or losing their faith, or somehow not being right about it. And so they get insecure. And so they're very insecure people to begin with, because they tend to be very inflexible. So it's easy for them to break. So rather than break, they just maintain separation as the best answer to all their relationships with people of other. It isn't just religion; it's race, it's everything. So we have that. Francis is saying the Christian message is a message of fraternity. It's a message of friendship, and you can't really maintain a friendship without that level of trust that gets into the deeper issues. I'm reminded of the conversations I've had. I sit on the national dialogue between the Catholic Bishops' Conference and the Jewish community, which is basically what they call the National Council of Synagogues. And I've also helped out on a separate dialogue, believe it or not, that we need to have with the Orthodox Jewish community because of the separations within Judaism. So it's interesting. The Orthodox Jewish community in the United States, at least, still carries with it a teaching of a great rabbi in the 1950s and 60s named Joseph Soloveitchik. And he felt that it was good to encounter, to make friends, to assist and help with Christians and other people, but never ever to discuss theology. Because of a fear that the Christian motivation for dialogue was always to convert you. And we Christians have a tremendous history of, and also, and there are good sides and bad sides to it, but a tremendous evangelization sort of, what shall we say, focus, because Jesus said, go out and baptize all nations. So we have that. We have that drive to basically proclaim the gospel to all people. The Muslim community also has a great sense of wanting to announce the truth of their teachings to the world. It's interesting. We have that in common. So it can become a little bit. It can become a little bit intimidating for people who aren't in a religion that's focused on making converts. So how can I say this? Trust has to be built up through the friendships first. But I think to be authentic to who you are is another element I get out of Fratelli Tutti, so that you can truly be who you are, so that you don't become the other, and you're never intimidated by the teachings of the other, but you are who you are, and either you're accepted as a friend or you're not accepted as a friend. This is the very basic to any human relationships, but in the mutual conversations between people of different faiths, this level of trust can only be built up through the relationship itself, so that you can get to a level where you can start saying, well, this is really what Paul means when he says something in one of his epistles, or this is what God is saying in the Quran. You know, you get to a respectful level of not just tolerance, but acceptance of the other as they are. But they have to be authentically who they are.
And Father Jim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, AJ. It's good to be with you.
As a part of World Interfaith Harmony Week, the Graymoor Ecumenical and InterReligious Institute, along with the Interfaith Center and other partners, invite you to join a free online discussion of Fratelli Tutti with diverse faith leaders and scholars on February 3rd. The event is called Paths of Peace to Heal Open Wounds, Interreligious Encounters with Pope Francis's Fratelli Tutti. It'll take place from 12 to 2 p.m. and is free and open to all. Registration is required, and you can do that at interfaithcenter.org. Interfaith Matters is hosted by me, AJ DeBonis. This episode was edited and produced by Kevin Childress. Our co-producer is Michelle Polton-Simon. As always, thanks for listening.